Okay, here we go. This is a lecture about the origins of the American Revolution, the developments that changed it into a revolution from just conversation about the powers of Parliament. We're going to talk a good deal about the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to talk about republicanism, the ideology that was at the basis of the revolution itself. So that's what we're going to cover, and here we go. Now, let's see, let's put me right there. Okay. The three developments that changed the conversation about the powers that the British government had over the colonies into a full-scale war for independence were, and this is my opinion, and since it's my class, oh well. The three things are the intolerable acts, the fact that Parliament passed these laws in 74 to punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party, that ratcheted things up quite a bit. The actual outbreak of fighting in April of 75 and in the weeks and months following that, they were shooting each other. And it's hard to kiss and make up when you're fighting an active war, which is what was going on. And the third thing, and the thing that's really what changed people's minds, was the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January of 76. I would say the majority of Americans were not for independence, even after the publication. But the ideas in Common Sense took root. They sort of asked the question, should an island be governing a continent? And the answer was no. Are kings the best way to organize the executive branch? The answer was no. It just seemed to Paine to be common sense for the American colonies to realize that they weren't English, that they were American, and that required them to assert themselves as an independent nation. So that radical idea took root in early 76 and led to independence. So Congress in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress, following the lead of John Adams, probably the most effective leader of the independence movement, began to gradually turn to independence. And a committee of 5 was appointed to write out a draft of the reasons compelling Congress to break free from England. So Jefferson wrote the draft apparently in one day. He just whipped it out. And Franklin changed the introduction to read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," whereas Jefferson had said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And that more rational, enlightenment-y sentiment infused the Declaration. So Congress voted to become independent of England on the 2nd of July. And John Adams rightfully wrote to Abigail, his wife, and said the 2nd of July should be celebrated with fireworks from this day forward. but he got the date wrong. Over the next 2 days, Congress debated and then finally, on the 4th of July, 1776, accepted the draft of the Declaration of Independence that we recognize today. So what you're celebrating on the 4th of July is really the document itself as our national birthday. It's a breakup letter. It's a Dear John letter. It more or less says to the English king, the problems are just too great. We have to break up. And that's more or less what happened. Now, they had to win the war, which took them 7 more years. So there really is no legal or legalistic kind of reason for the declaration, but it is a statement of principles and ideas that we wanted to go on the record as saying this is what we're fighting for. So the preamble to the declaration is just a throat clearing kind of exercise that says we should do this. There are 5 logical steps that follow. The first is the statement of the philosophy, the idea that all men are created equal, and that's a big deal, and says that governments are instituted by men by the consent of the governed, that's the true source of governmental power. And that idea is also revolutionary. The majority of the declaration is a listing of the grievances, part 2. It says that the king has done all these rotten things, and for these reasons, we need to break free. It does list that the king fostered African slavery among the colonists, and they wouldn't have enslaved Africans without the king making them do it. This, of course, was nonsense, and so the Congress edited that grievance out. It also listed that the ruthless savages, the Native Americans at the time, were on the warpath because of the king. And that too is kind of crazy, but it's in there to this day. The third logical step is to say we've tried. We've petitioned the English, we've talked with the king, but he just won't listen. They then declare independence and pledge everything, their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor in support of the Declaration of Independence. Now, one of the things I want you to understand is who exactly is declaring independence. In the second to last paragraph, or really the last long paragraph, they more or less say grammatically that they are publishing and declaring the reasons for this separation. And it's 13 states that are declaring independence. It's a plural concept. They are 13 colonies declaring independence. It should go with stating out loud that there were many colonies in the West Indies that were not declaring independence. But these 13 colonies were declaring independence. So why bother when you just need to win the war? Why bother with the letter? Well, the answer is that the Declaration of Independence was written for the French. We needed the French assistance to gain independence, and this declaration made it clear that we were not going to be in this war in order to kiss and make up and someday in the future. Okay. I want to just briefly talk about republicanism. All the founders of the 18th century were Republicans. They did not form a political party until 20 years later, but they believed that a state did not need a king, and that made them Republicans. They believed in a republican form of government, and that means the people elect representatives to make the laws. So that was operative in the 18th century. This illustration is from Thomas Hobbes's book, Leviathan. The illustration says, basically, the humans are violent and we need strong government to protect property. So in the 1650s, when Hobbes wrote his book, it was in the wake of the English Civil War. And what he was calling for was a government that was powerful enough to protect property. And he thought that was the chief end of government. So that's the first element of what's known as gentry republicanism, the ideology of rich landowners that are the gentry. I'm going to walk you through 9 more pieces of this ideology. So government needs to be given a lot of power to protect property, but power corrupts. Number 2, we need to control the power of government through frequent elections, through free press, through mechanisms that limit the power of government. They did not believe in pure democracy. They thought that pure democracy, letting everyone vote, was equal to mob rule. And they did not want mob rule. They wanted a property form of government, which is wrapped up in the idea of civic virtue, public virtue. The citizens need to be selfless, virtuous, both for the good of all, not for the good of myself, selfishly. So citizens need to be virtuous. But 5, that's in direct conflict with number 1, which said that people were naturally violent and took property from each other. So how could there be a republic that was selfless when people are inherently selfish? What can you do about this? Well, number 6, that you make this public virtue requiring property ownership. You ground property ownership into the idea of a public citizen that makes an individual independent. If you own your own farm, as most Americans did, and you had no boss, you didn't work for someone else, that could mean that you would vote virtuously. You would vote for the good of all. And it was more or less that gamble that the American experiment was founded in. Number 7, citizenship, easy for me to say, implies mastery over dependence. It's in its very nature a male concept. Women couldn't be citizens because they didn't have public property. They favored a mixed government of executive, legislative, and judicial functions separated in the structure of the government itself, a system of checks and balances to keep the government from getting too powerful. So a president can veto laws, the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional, the Congress can remove the president through impeachment, etc. All those checks and balances written into the Constitution were 18th century Republican ideas that found their way into the nature of our government. And number 9 is that all republics degenerate and decay. Eventually, as time goes on, all republics in history have had wealth accumulated in a very few hands. And when it gets to that point, the republics disappear. So what Jefferson and Madison and other founding fathers were trying to do was delay that moment when the republic would become corrupt by natural economic concentration at the top. So that's gentry republicanism. The artisanal republicanism of Tom Paine and others had a vision of a republican that was connecting with independent workers in shops and towns who own their own tools and shops and labor. And that ownership of their own labor is the origin of the free labor ideology and includes many more people in the vision of who's allowed to be a citizen. And this democratizing impact of the idea of artisanal republicanism eventually will win the day, will have more Americans brought into the fold of being able to have public virtue by virtue of their independence and ownership of their own labor, so that it could work with the independent workers. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for listening.